Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I'm back after what was a beautiful wedding of my youngest niece, my last redhead niece to get married off, in the beautiful fall foliage of the Robert Frost, New England. It was absolutely breathtaking. Even though it was a whirlwind trip, it was just a great opportunity to be with my family, to ruminate and to vegetate with them. My brother lives on the East Coast. He has 4 kids. They're all over the place. I don't get to spend a lot of time with them. So for many of them, it had been about 8 years since I'd seen those kids. So it was a lot of time gap between the time I've been able to be with them and visit with them. I knew as we were in the midst of preparing for this wedding that Dana was back here preaching with you and to you and for you. And with the great capacity now that we have of watching sermons online, I watched her sermon from start to finish and was absolutely mesmerized by what she talked to you about. I love the analogy of the marble jar of friends. I loved how she talked to you about the church at Corinth and the painful letter that Paul had to write to the church. I loved how she talked about, at the very end, the tear-jerking and always beautiful story of the Velveteen Rabbit. I even caught the line that she made about, well, Michelle chose the fun and easy topic of the fun and lovely. And left me with truth-telling and forgiveness. That was in the lineup, and she chose which week she was willing to take. She managed it just fine, amen? She did. But I want to give a caveat on all of these sermons that we're given in this series. There is no way that we have enough time to talk about relationships and their depth and everything we want you to know about them. It's a Cliff Notes version, and I want to encourage you to do some of the reading. Unfortunately, we failed to get it in your this little handout for you or the other handout. Well, I'll take ownership for that, not getting it in. But in the later bulletin, you'll see that we do have a list of 4 different books that I'm recommending to you on the topic of boundary making, and you might want to take a peek at that, grab one of the bulletins in the service, or I'll have Pam just post it on the website for you so you can see it. So that resource list will be a help for you, and then the questions that are included can be some soul searching for you. Well, back to the wedding, I want to say a couple of things to you about it. It was very beautiful, it was spiritual, it was relevant. I watched a gentleman who had watched Cassidy from the time she was a little girl grow up, perform this wedding, and give a charge to Cassidy and Troy that was like none other. You know, if a wedding is done well, all of us who are sitting there are reminded of what we said we would do for one another. Yeah. And he gave them a beautiful charge in the midst of their love, which we know now is still infatuation. It's still that, and we know that. We know that in time it will grow real and raw, and for better, for worse, and for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, they'll understand more what that means. But I couldn't help but think as I was sitting there watching the wedding, hey, they're doing that very same thing back home. As the Lake Oswegians gather in this Methodist church, we're talking about relationships and what it takes for them to last and to be pure and wholesome. And we know what some of those things are, whether it's in the marital relationship or not. It's to be kind to one another. It's to be respectful. It's to practice humility when we need to practice humility and say, I'm sorry. It's to be truthful, sometimes painfully so, but in love, but to be that. It's to be playful. Don't forget to play. It's beautiful. It's to be forgiving. And it's to be loving, even when you don't feel like loving. Remember, we talked about that? To do that when the house light comes on, and dirty socks are on the floor, and there's morning halitosis, and there's male-patterned baldness, and there's middle-aged spread. We keep loving in the midst of all of that because it's the right thing to do. The second thing that came out of me for this wedding was this. When you don't get the opportunity to be around your family for a long period of time, and for those of you who are around family all the time, you're constantly doing this dance and this, you know that. You have to check yourself, what you say, what you do, you can't, yeah. So I got to room with my mom in the hotel room. And my mom is the most southern, genteel woman you could ever meet. Decorum, dress, everything. And so even though I'm 58 years old, every time I'm with her, I'm checking myself. What do I look like? What do I have on? Is this appropriate? And you wonder why I wear that hair and makeup. You can take the girl out of the South, but you can't take the South out of the girl. It's deeply embedded. And when I'm with her, especially, whether she says anything or not, you know what I mean. You know what I mean, folks. It was there. So there were some things we talked about and some things we didn't. Like we didn't talk about politics. And we didn't talk about the state of the nation. We didn't talk about the United Methodist Church and its future. We also didn't talk about who was going to win the Super Bowl. Because she's a big Patriots fan and I am not. So we didn't talk about it. We just didn't go there. And then when I went to my brother's home, we, not being around those kids for so long, and they had some struggles, and I had some struggles with what do we share and what don't we, and how raw do we get, and how much do we expose, and what will they think of us? You know those dances we play. It's a boundary thing. And we all do it. We all put ourselves in check with our relationships, whether it's with a spouse or with a child or with a friend or those we play golf with or we play music with or we do Bible study with. We always are checking our perceptions, what we say, what we don't say, what we do. It's just a part of self-preservation. What is a boundary? What is a boundary? It's the ability to test what's yours and what's mine and what's not yours and what's not mine. People who have good boundaries might say this, that's not mine. I don't have a dog in that race. And they stay out of that race. Others jump right in headlong because they always think they have a dog in the race. Boundaries are learning when to say yes, letting your yes be yes, and your no be no, so that you have some modicum of control over your life. Here's the news. None of us have full control over our lives. We know that. But the stronger we get with our boundaries, the easier it is for us to let our yes be yes and let our no be no and maintain some control. That's the kind of authenticity that I want in my life. And I suspect it's the kind that you want in yours too. I think this text today is such a beautiful example. It seems like it might be a little bit askew because it's the son that's drawing boundaries with the parents, but hey, you've all had teenagers. And you know that part of the beauty of raising children is that they do individuate, they differentiate from you. And how they do that is sometimes some of them cross the line before it's time, like yours right up against the edge, and those who scooted over and those who were way in the back. So here's Jesus setting a boundary with his parents. A little 12-year-old boy, but I want to say more about that. But first I want to give you some fun facts about this text that you might not know. You likely know that this is the first and the last canonized text that we have of Jesus in his boyhood. At 12 years old, you might be interested to know that lots of other cultures have famous people coming of age at 12, and the stories are told about them about this age too in preteen times. This is the story that tells us about his human development, his relationship with God, the first clue that we have of his unique relationship with God. But because it's the only story that we have about Jesus in boyhood, nature abhors a vacuum. You know that. And so you had some later writers that created apocryphal texts about Jesus and his boyhood. One of those key texts is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Steve, you probably have a copy of it. I've got a copy of it in my office. Have any of you ever seen it, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas? Not to be confused with the Gospel of Thomas, which is more widely publicized. Okay, so this tells the story of Jesus when he was ages 3 to 12. And he was a real ringer, according to these later writers. And for many people, they're so fanciful that they're not believable. But stories like this, at the age 5, he makes birds out of mud and he claps his hands and they fly away. Or he's working in the carpenter shop with Joseph and the board isn't long enough, but he stretches it to make it long enough so Joseph can use it for whatever he wants. But then there's also these two stories where a boy jostles and teases him in the marketplace and he strikes him dead. And his friends are so mad that they tell on him. And then the last story I'll share, because it's probably all we can handle at this point, is that there was a little boy who fell off of a roof and died. Jesus was blamed for it and he raised him from the dead so he wouldn't be accused of doing it. I like Luke's version of the 12-year-old Jesus, and I'm going to let my imagination take you of what Jesus did from 3 to 12. But, because people have have used their imaginations, we get some of these later texts. It's interesting to think about. But if he was divine and human, what kind of normal childhood did he have? Did he need a timeout? Was he always good? Have you ever thought about that? Interestingly, Jesus' parents were probably in the place that they were willing to set boundaries with him because they had let him move and travel among the caravan of friends and guests that were making their way to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. But Luke tells us that after they make their way back, it's one full day before they realize he's missing. And then when they go back to Jerusalem, it's another 3 full days before they find him in the temple. And he's holding his own there with all of the Jewish respected leaders, doing scripture study and midrash with him and talking about texts and asking questions. And I love his mother's response. At first she was astonished like the rest of the people. And then she did the very thing that you and I would probably do. You know, when you find your child after you've lost him in the midst of the Christmas shopping out in the middle of Portland, and at first you're so excited, and then you're what? How could you do this to us? Don't you know you nearly caused us to have a heart attack? Anxiety-ridden that we were? What would have happened if we had a heart attack? Jesus, what then? What then? So check his response. What? Didn't you know that I would be here in my Father's house? My Father's business to do. He was clear on who he was. At 12, he knew he had a mission and a purpose. He knew he was safe. There was no reason for them to be worried. He was clear on what his boundary was, his mission, his ministry. And so he wasn't unlike so many other 12-year-olds, except most 12-year-olds don't have that kind of mission yet. But he was individuating from his parents. An unusual situation, but a situation in Scripture, one of many where we see that Jesus was an assertive person. There's a difference in aggression and passivity and assertive. I want you to hear that clearly. One of the books I'm recommending to you that we'll put on the website is called Speaking the Truth in Love, How to Be an Assertive Christian. And it's one of the Stephen Ministry resources, Dave. You would recognize that. How to live assertively so people don't take advantage of you and steal your freedom. How to speak the truth in love as you understand it. And some of us struggle with that. We'll talk a bit about why we do. Jesus lived assertively. He spoke the truth in love as he understood it. I want you to think about some of the cases in Scripture where he did this. In his righteous rage, when the money changers were in the temple and he overthrew the tables. Yes. When he called the religious leaders at that time a brood of vipers. Or when he said to all those gathered around, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword. Or when healing on the Sabbath, he was judged by the Pharisees, but he did it anyway. Or facing the false charges that were charged against him and choosing to go to the cross. And he chose to do that. That was an assertive move, not a passive move, a very assertive and planned move. How good are you at setting boundaries in your own life and in your relationships and with the people you love? Dead silence. How good are you at doing it with your spouse, with your children, with your grandchildren, with your family, friends, co-workers? And when it's hard, why is it hard? And then who is it the hardest with to set those boundaries? Some of the reasons that we don't set those boundaries is that we have a fear that we're going to lose the relationship. That people will think poorly of us. They'll lose confidence in us. Or maybe they'll think that we're angry or we're selfish. We're mean-spirited. Now, forgive me, I'm going to be honest here. If you're a man and you set boundaries, yeah, way to go. If you're a woman and you set boundaries, you know what you are? You're a bitch. I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. It becomes hard. It becomes hard sometimes. Sometimes we set boundaries as you think about technology. We have a hard time setting boundaries because we don't want to miss out. Fear of missing out. What if somebody posts something and I miss it? What if something is going on better in their life than mine? Or what if I can best that? Come on, folks, we all do it. I struggle with it. What to post and what not to post. What am I trying to say and what am I not trying to say? I have a handout on that for later. Sometimes we don't set boundaries because we out of guilt, maybe we owe something to somebody. We feel like we've not been what somebody has needed us to be, and so we overcompensate. Sometimes we don't set boundaries because we're codependent with people. We're trying to cover up for them or rescue them from being responsible. And in my ministry, I've seen it over and over again with parents who can't set boundaries for children or in their relationships. And they're the ones who suffer when they can't do that. What's at risk when our boundaries become too permeable? We lose our sense of self and identity. We lose respect and the confidence of others. We compromise God's power that He gave us to love, to be involved, to engage, to change, to dream. And we open ourselves to be taken advantage of by other people when we can't set a boundary. We risk anxiety and depression because we won't talk about why we struggle with this relationship. We just stay in it anyway. We risk, in some cases, suicide. Some people choose that over facing the one they need to, or physical illness or more. We lose authenticity in our relationships. How many of us are in relationships that we would rather not be in, but we're in them out of fear for what would happen if we aren't? How many of you are in relationships where you've given your freedom away in order to stay in because the pain of facing it is greater than the pain of remaining the same? We all struggle with it. Many deep boundary issues are as a result of family of origin issues, for example. Families that have alcoholism or addiction in them, there's a tremendous amount of overcompensating, of keeping the secret, and those within that family system come out with their own sickness because of trying to manage that secret. Families that struggle with neglect and trauma and abuse. Families that have had someone that perhaps had a mental illness as a child or an adult, and an excessive amount of attention maybe was given to a child with a need and the other was neglected, though not intentionally, but it happened. The younger the trauma occurs and the more prolonged it is, usually the harder it is for someone to break free of that, but by God's grace they can, but it becomes harder the younger that trauma was experienced. You all know people. One of my best friends was raped by a family member. She has never since that time been able to sustain a relationship with a man that she considered of great value because she lost the ability to trust. We know what that's like. I want you to hear that the basis of all boundary making, if you hear nothing else, is this. The basis of making boundaries and setting boundaries in all of life is love. It's love of self and respect of self. It's love of others. And it's love of God. One of the books I'm going to recommend to you, Boundaries, How to Say Yes, When to Say No, and How to Take Control of Your Life, will publish it for you. Dr. Henry Cloud and John Townsend said this: whatever the context and with whomever we're dealing, these are the four things that boundaries are made up of: freedom, self-control, responsibility, and love. When we set boundaries, we are setting ourselves free. Free not to be engaged in this behavior. Free not to respond out of line. Free to stay connected even when it hurts to stay connected. Free to make choices where we maintain self-control and don't get out of line when perhaps an offender is being that way with us. How do we it's hard. None of us are perfect. We all struggle. Responsibility. Taking responsibility for ourselves and letting other people take responsibility for themselves. Not rescuing, letting people deal with consequences in love. Another formula to remember is this: freedom first and service second. Freedom first and service second. I hesitate to say this because we're in the midst of nominations and we've asked several of you to take some huge positions in the church. You're free to say no. You are free to say no, but I hope before you say no, you'll really search your heart and let us do work and conversation with you and decide, is this where you choose to give your time? Because you're going to be far more effective if you choose to do it rather than do it because we've asked you to and you don't really want to do it. There's a handout. I'm not going to have time to go through all of it, but there's a handout on digital boundaries that I want you to take a moment and look at. This is one of the boundaries that they talk about in this book. How attached are you to your digital equipment? How much do you control it and how much does it control you? Wish I had time to talk about it, but I'm going to encourage you to do some reading on your own, and you can decide if it has mastered you or if you have mastered it. I will say this. Gary and I were on the way to our 9th anniversary dinner the other night. We were on the way to eat, and then we were going to watch Judy. If you've not seen it, it's incredible, and you must see it. And here we are on the way to our anniversary dinner, and I'm texting away with somebody at the church. And he looks at me and says, "Really? Are you kidding me?" We all struggle with it. What is our boundary? How often do we have to check the text? One of the things it suggests is take a full 24 hours and get off of social media. Get offline, get off that. What would happen if you close your Facebook account down for a week or so? I was with a clergy friend this week who said she'd been on a month-long vacation to Italy. She didn't even take her computer. We said, how did it feel? She said it was great. Then, now it's killing me. Because she's trying to respond to all those emails. But can you imagine what would it mean to unplug and to set that boundary for herself? You know what you struggle with, whether it's time or task, or whether it's money, issues around food, or whatever personal boundaries you need to set for yourself with girls. Finally, I leave you with this. Back at the temple with Jesus, even though he confronted his parents in love about what he understood his role to be, what the choices that he was making and why, he didn't shame them in front of people. He didn't throw a tantrum. You know what he did? He went home with them. And he was obedient to them. And as a result of that, Scripture tells us he grew in grace and love and in the favor of God and humanity. And folks, that's what I want to say to all of us. Life is messy and complicated, and we'd like to think the church relationships are perfect and everybody gets along and there's never any problems, but it doesn't work that way because after all, we're just family. But those of us who will do best together will love each other, will forgive each other, will set clear boundaries, say this is my line and this is your stuff and this is mine, but can we do this thing together? Because God gives us a freedom to love and stay engaged in the midst of all of our joys and sorrows. If we can set clear and loving boundaries, then we are truly, truly free. My prayer for all of us is that we will know that freedom that comes in Christ and in love and in depth and honest relationships. Thanks be to God.